Rockwell Seay, damages argument, plaintiff, pain and suffering. May it please the court, counsel, members of the jury, Daniel Cooper. That was a person's name. And Daniel was someone's son. He was someone's husband. And he was the father of 2 small children. He was a living, breathing person. But not anymore. Now, over the course of this trial, we have come to know why it is that Daniel died. And frankly, we know that it is this defendant who is responsible for it. The evidence has shown us that. It has been proven. But there is still yet something that must be done. There is something that must be done by you. Something that can only be done by you, and something that can only be done now, here in this courtroom today. I wish that I could tell you that that task was waving a magic wand that could somehow stop this defendant's employer from letting him get back behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler big rig truck after they had determined that he had a prescription drug problem. I wish that we could wave that magic wand so that somehow, some way, this defendant either wouldn't have been behind the wheel on that particular night, or that he wouldn't have been drugged out that night, or that he very at least wouldn't have struck the tiny Ford Ranger that was being driven by Daniel Cooper. Members of the jury, I'm sure we all wish that that magic wand gave us the power to raise Daniel Cooper from the grave. The ability to ensure that Daniel Cooper died in his bed a long time from now, an old man, rather than in that fiery wreckage on a Dallas highway as a young man. We have no such power. We have no such magic wand. Rather, members of the jury, your task is to put a price tag on the suffering of Daniel Cooper, on the excruciating and unyielding pain that he suffered in the last moments of his life. I'd like to talk with you for just a moment about Daniel and also his final moments. Daniel Cooper was 33 years old, and he was a Bible salesman. And this job took him from town to town and place to place. But on this particular night, Daniel Cooper was in his town. He was in his place. And he was going home to see the children and the wife that had not seen him for a few days. He was going home. But he'd never get there. You see, as he was driving his little Ford Ranger on the highway here in Dallas between the airport and his house, his little truck was struck violently by a monster machine, an 18-wheeler who had at its wheel a man who should have never been there, a man with a prescription drug problem, a man who on that particular night, the evidence has shown, was not exactly clean. And when that monster of a truck smashed into his little Ford Ranger, it flung it violently across the road. And when it did, the steel of that little truck's frame, the machinery of its engine, and all the nuts and bolts in between, they came crashing in on Daniel Cooper. Now, I can't tell you why exactly that Daniel Cooper didn't get out of that truck. But we heard medical testimony here today which showed that Mr. Cooper had injuries consistent with being pinned inside. We also heard testimony of someone who was driving by shortly after the accident that they heard the faint screams of a man inside trying to escape. But what we do know, members of the jury, that it was at some point after that violent collision that the truck caught on fire. And Cooper tried to breathe, his lungs filled with smoke and soot and fire, and it burned all the way down. And then when he tried to breathe again, he breathed in fire, and again, until he didn't try anymore. He breathed fire until he didn't breathe anymore. And for every moment, he was experiencing immense physical pain. He had just been in a violent accident. His body was pinned inside, and he was being consumed by the fires of hell. You see, what I didn't tell you about Mr. Cooper is that to him the Bible was not just a book to be sold. It was a book that was lived. It was a book that was believed. And in his final moments, he experienced the hell of its revelations. He was burned. He was suffocated. He died as if he had drowned in a lake of fire. Slowly and excruciatingly. Not because the flame itself consumed him and burned him to death, but first because the smoke smothered him, robbing him of the vital oxygen that his body needed to live. I can't tell you how those last excruciating moments were spent. Maybe they were spent scratching and punching and fighting and doing everything necessary to try to escape that molten metal coffin that he found himself in. Maybe those final moments were spent with images of his babies in his mind. Babies that he would never see again. A daughter that he would never walk down the aisle, and a son that he would never get to go to baseball practice with. Whatever it was, his last moments, he could have experienced those things because medical testimony tells us that he was alive for several minutes after that accident. Alive for several moments before he died. Alive and aware. As Daniel Cooper was being swallowed by fire, he knew it. As Daniel Cooper was dying, he had to know it. As Daniel Cooper was dying, he could do nothing about it. What is that worth? How much would someone have to pay a man to get into an old truck and be burned to death? How much would we have to pay someone to do that? I don't know. But what I can tell you is that we see in the news all the time that there's these fancy paintings by the classics, the masters, the Rembrandts, the Monets. They cost millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. Let's just imagine a $10 million painting by Monet or some such person was sitting in his passenger seat on his drive home from Dallas Airport to his house. And let's say then that the accident happened exactly the same way that it did. Only this time, someone was in a position to save him. And let's say that person recognized that painting and knew its worth. What would a good person do? Would a good person save the man and the flesh from being consumed by fire, or would it save the oil paint and the canvas from being consumed by fire? I assert to you, members of the jury, that most folks would save the man, because the life was worth more than the money of that painting. It's worth more. I assert that the excruciating, horrific, and unyielding pain that he had to suffer in the final moments of his life is worth at least $10 million. Whatever number that you determine is best, be it higher or be it lower, that is for you to decide. But remember, members of the jury, that Mr. Cooper, his family, this is their day in court. If we don't get it right today, they don't get to come back in here tomorrow or the day after that and get another chance. This is the only opportunity that there is to make it right. And the only people that can do that are you. The only people who can provide justice for Daniel Cooper are sitting in your chairs. Thank you for your time.